This program is proudly brought to you by Holden Astra and Telstra. From National 9 News, this is Nightline with Hugh Riminton.
Labour ranks divided over Simon CREAN's new asylum seeker policy. Weapons inspectors launch surprise raid on Saddam's palace. And Peter Garrett tipped for politics as Midnight Oil calls it quits. Good evening. Also in the news tonight, the crowds gather for Australia's exclusive eclipse of the sun. The Labor Party has released its long-awaited immigration policy, significantly softening its stand on asylum seekers and winning guarded support from churches and refugee support groups. However, some opposition MPs are not convinced the changes are enough, raising the prospects of a split vote when the policy goes for ratification before caucus.
The Labor Party's Me Too approach on asylum seekers in last year's election campaign, echoing the government's tough line, angered sections of the party. Today, opposition leader Simon CREAN and Shadow Immigration Minister Julia Gillard unveiled a new, softer policy.
Labor can better protect our borders whilst at the same time treating asylum seekers decently.
Children would be released from behind the razor wire, Woomera would be closed, and 90% of refugee claims would be determined within 90 days. There'd also be a new US-style green card system to crack down on illegal foreign workers. But
mandatory detention is proposed to continue under these recommendations.
Also, Labor would continue the exclusion of the Christmas Island refugee facility from Australia's migration zone.
Christmas Island is being turned into a massive prison for people fleeing from injustice elsewhere in the world.
Carmen Lawrence was one of 3 senior Labor frontbenchers to dissent when the new policy was approved by Shadow Cabinet last night.
They are matters of concern to the wider Labor Party as well.
In Sydney, refugee support groups presented to ALP headquarters a petition signed by more than 8,000 people demanding an end to mandatory detention.
Unless a real alternative is presented, they'll go to the next election looking just like a pale imitation of the Liberals again.
I'm not pretending that there aren't differences in the party, never have done.
Mr CREAN needs to resolve those differences before caucus votes on the new policy on Thursday. Laurie Oakes for Nightline.
Washington says it now has conclusive evidence Al-Qaeda was behind 2 terrorist attacks in Africa last week. Discarded missile launches left behind from an attempt to shoot down an Israeli jet over Kenya display the same serial numbers as a batch used by Al-Qaeda when it tried to destroy an American warplane over Saudi Arabia earlier this year. They say they've also found a direct link with Al-Qaeda in one of the suicide bombers who blew up a Kenyan hotel, killing 13 people. It was also revealed today that Jemaah Islamiyah, the Indonesian group linked to the Bali atrocity, was planning an attack on the Sydney Olympics. Intelligence agents in Singapore say a terrorist team was trained and ready to strike, but was reportedly talked out of an attack by the group's Australian leader. Anger continues to brew in Asia over the Prime Minister's promise to launch, if necessary, preemptive attacks against terrorists overseas. Malaysia has threatened that could lead to war. Other neighbouring nations are equally unimpressed.
Australian troops not allowed! Forward, stay out!
The Australian Embassy in the Philippines was the scene of this demonstration, although the Prime Minister's comments have stirred condemnation as well in Malaysia, Indonesia and Thailand. In Manila, the issue has particular resonance, as several terrorist groups with links to Al-Qaeda are known to have bases in the south and west of the country.
Mr. Howard does not have the right to threaten sovereign countries like the Philippines with preemptive first strike. Mr. Howard does not have the right to send Australian troops to the Philippines.
Malaysia's Mahathir Mohamad, a leader with a long history of antagonism with Australia, says he would consider any preemptive strikes on Malaysian territory as an act of war.
If anybody fires rockets or use unmanned aircraft to assassinate anybody in Malaysia, we will consider that as a crime, and we will also consider that as an act of aggression, and we will take action against the nation which carries out such acts.
But Mr. Howard has won support from our most powerful ally, the United States.
A nation that remains in the status quo after an event like September 11th can only endanger its own people. It requires a fresh approach to protect the country.
The official spokesman for President Bush, Mr. Fleischer, says preemptive strikes are only appropriate in a war against terrorism. United Nations weapons inspectors have swooped on one of Saddam Hussein's presidential palaces as they continue the search for weapons of mass destruction. It is their biggest test yet of their new powers to carry out inspections anywhere they want to. Arguments about access to the palaces was one of the major stumbling blocks during the last round of inspections in the 1990s. Tonight's development comes as America and Britain try to rack up the diplomatic pressure on Iraq.
For 6 days now, the UN has inspected sites, and the United States and Britain are not surprised the inspectors have failed to turn up any sign of Saddam's reputed weapons arsenal. Once again, the two powerful allies are laying out their case for war against the Iraqi regime. The US president approved major new military spending and expressed doubt about the current inspections.
So far, the signs are not encouraging.
And the British government released an intelligence report detailing Saddam Hussein's use of torture to hold power, acid baths and tongue amputations among the dictator's favoured ways of silencing opponents. Not that the Allies expect the inspectors to find evidence of this either. This morning, through Baghdad's foggy streets, they got lost trying to find their first venue of the day.
The inspectors are not in Iraq to play hide and seek with Mr. Saddam Hussein. Inspectors do not have the duty or the ability to uncover terrible weapons hidden in a vast country.
And the US is waiting for Saddam to play games with the next UN-imposed deadline. By December 8th, he must supply a full list of all his lethal weapons. It's thought if he complies, Saddam will hand over a confusing mountain of paperwork, all written in Arabic, that will take days, even weeks to interpret. In the United States, Michael Usher for Nightline.
Back home now, and in a major calling to account, the ANZ Bank has offered to pay fines, costs and compensation to 250,000 customers. The total bill to the bank, $8 million. The ANZ has admitted persistently obstructing a 13-year investigation into hidden charges and wrong interest rates.
When the Marathon case finally came to court this morning, the ANZ Bank did not dispute evidence it had displayed persistent inertia, indifference and incompetence towards 250,000 customers who had taken out personal loans between 1985 and 1996. That after the bank was notified of countless errors in its paperwork that disguised hidden charges and incorrect interest rates, it took 4 years to initially respond. And when it did, its strategy was to obstruct and frustrate its customers and the Consumer Credit Legal Service. One internal senior executive memo said, appear ready to deal with the matter, but delay as long as possible in the hope individual complainants will lose patience. Today, the bank agreed to pay a fine of $5.25 million, compensation of $1.65 million to customers, and an estimated $1.5 million in legal fees, a total of $8.4 million.
Well, I think that message has been learnt by the banking industry in recent times, that there is an importance to getting documentation right, giving proper disclosure.
Having frustrated the investigation for so many years, the ANZ eventually had a complete change of heart, offering full cooperation and an abject apology to its customers.
Our behaviour over the period where these problems existed from the early 90s has been appalling.
Charles Slade for Nightline.
Victorian Premier Steve Bracks created more political history today, naming 29-year-old Bendigo MP Jacinta Allen as the state's youngest ever minister. He also appointed the first female Speaker of the House, Essendon MP Judy Madigan. And completing his historic appointments, the Premier made former Minister Monica Gould the first female President of the Upper House. He will allocate portfolios to a jubilant new ministry later this week. In federal politics, the attacks on Helen Coonan continued today. The Prime Minister again forced to defend his Assistant Treasurer over property holdings of the Senator and her husband Andrew Rogers. Labor says Mr Rogers claimed a Sydney waterfront property as his principal residence, potentially avoiding a hefty tax bill.
This has all the hallmarks of a desperate smear campaign by an opposition that believes in nothing and has got no policies.
Yeah. Labor leader Simon CREAN is demanding the Prime Minister personally investigate the matter. Former HIH Director Rodney Adler faces up to 10 years jail after being charged with manipulating the stock